month for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Not Once for Yes.
Welcome to 2022. We're still wrapped up warm here at KOFY HQ as winter is hanging on with all its might, and the sun still sneaks off early to bed. It won't be long before we'll be enjoying the sunshine much later, so whilst we still have the close dark evenings, what better to do than wrap up under a blanket in front of the fireplace and enjoy some ghost stories.
So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up with this episode, we have a ghost with opinions on interior design and a paranormal convention for the age of that which shall not be named on the paranormal radar, listener stories from Kevin, Molly, Robert and Pat, and we travel to Hitchin in Hertfordshire in search of ghosts.
But before we get stuck into all of that spooky goodness, we want to say a massive thank you to our latest patrons.
Anne French,
John,
Robert Johnston,
Kim Sacchio Kent,
Kat,
and Dale Crisp.
And also thank you to Jess and Tom in Bedford and Pat Davies for making donations through KOFY.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons, old and new, and KOFY supporters. We really couldn't do this without you. We're so honoured and grateful to have your support, and we absolutely love sharing all our weird and wonderful adventures with you through our vlogs, our Zoom meetups, and of course, our episodes.
We're also excited to announce that we're now available on Repod.
So Repod is a really new app, and it's a bit like a podcast player mashed with Twitter. We're trying it out because basically we think it's a really cool idea. I'm not that great at checking my Twitter and Facebook and all the social media stuff, but I do like to have the community. Like, our KOFY community is brilliant. You guys are amazing, and I love interacting with you. But this kind of gives us a place to have all of our episodes and our whole podcast feed, everything to listen to in the same places we can interact with you.
Yeah, you can comment on the episode, you can highlight a bit of an episode that you like. So if you enjoyed a story or there's a funny thing you want to share with other people, you can just do a little clip and post that and tag people in it, much, again, like Twitter combined with a podcast player. It also allows donations and subscriptions. So whilst the app itself is free, you can listen to it, you can chat with us. You can also access all of our bonus content that we're currently hosting on Patreon.
So if you're a Patreon subscriber, that won't affect your Patreon. We're not moving from one to the other. No. It's just another option. Mm-hmm. You can either use the Repod app to listen to our episodes and interact with us completely free. The app has no charge. But if you want to be a supporter, you can do a very similar thing to how you can on Patreon currently. You can donate to support us, and then you get access to all of our bonus content.
So yeah, we're not stopping Patreon.
No.
You can still keep subscribing on there if you're currently a Patreon subscriber. But if you'd like an alternative, then this is another option for you.
It's just a cool new thing that we think is fun. And the other cool thing about it is that if you've been thinking about becoming a supporter, but you're not sure whether you want to commit to it because you're not sure what kind of bonus content we produce, at the moment through Repod, you can actually subscribe to us, become a supporter effectively, for a month for free, as like a free trial. So you can sign up as a supporter, and then you can access our bonus content for a month to just see whether you like it.
Yep, all you need to do is enter the code FRIENDS during checkout and you'll get a free month, and that'll get you access to all of our bonus content. And whether you want to subscribe or not, you can join us on Repod by going to joinrepod.com/KOFY. On an Android phone, that'll take you to the Google Play Store. On an iPhone, it will take you to the Apple Store. And on a desktop, it will take you to the show on the website.
So it's pretty new, and I love the idea of having this kind of community aspect to my podcast feed, but I'd love to know what you guys think. So do check it out and let us know.
And whilst we're on the subject of supporting the show, if you are a patron and you're expecting some physical rewards, we had a little bit of a hold-up.
Yeah, we thought we were being really clever, and we came up with this awesome idea of making fridge magnets as rewards, and we were really excited about it. We thought we'd get some really cool designs on there. We found a place to do them, and we ordered them, and now we have a ton of fridge magnet rewards, and then we realised we couldn't post them to anybody because we'd been utter numpties and we'd forgot to check the postage laws, and you can't actually legally post fridge magnets without wrapping them in like 2 centimetres of packaging, which is a lot of packaging.
Yeah.
And it just turned out that it wasn't practical. So we're a bit gutted about that, and we've had to go back to the drawing board. So please don't worry, your rewards are coming. We just messed up. And that's a lesson we've learned for next time. So Fitz, what have you got for us on today's Paranormal Radar?
Well, our first Paranormal Radar story this episode comes from an article in The Mirror, where a supposedly snooty ghost takes offence at a Surrey couple's choice of soft furnishings. Now, I don't know if it's the journalists themselves or someone else at The Mirror that writes the subheadings, but they really went all out to try and make this one sound as dramatic as possible, declaring that a snooty ghost sent furnishings flying around the living room. I'm sure that I don't need to tell you, dear listeners, that the actual video is just a tiny, tiny bit less dramatic than they might have led you to believe. And before I go on with the story, I just need to interject a little to say that this story highlights a couple of issues with the modern paranormal field in my eyes. The first is more of a reporting issue than a paranormal issue, in that newspapers and websites want readers and viewers, so they do feel the need to over-egg the pudding and make things sound a little bit more exciting than they might be in the cold, hard light of day. In this case, furnishings flying around the room is a bit of an exaggeration, as, to make a long story short, a cushion falls off the sofa.
Is that it? Is that all? I haven't seen this.
I am being a little bit facetious, but not by much. I'm not sure that we'll ever solve the problem of papers trying to make things sound more exciting than they are, but it also highlights another issue in the reporting of paranormal events. What, if anything, can we believe? In this case, Warren Passmore was woken one night by his wife Donna, who believed she was hearing sounds coming from downstairs. She showed him a short clip from one of their security cameras that showed a cushion falling from their sofa. Unimpressed, Warren went back to sleep, but when he woke in the morning, he took another look at the video. Like me, he found the video a bit odd. Now, take a look for yourselves, and as usual, it will be linked in the show notes on the website. It is very short and shows a cushion lying on the edge of the sofa. What's strange about it is that the cushion spins slowly a bit, pauses, and then continues to spin off the edge of the sofa. So, why do I say it highlights a problem? Well, it's just so easy to fake. A bit of fishing line tied to the zip and someone out of shot of the camera, and boom, you've got yourself a paranormal video. It's so frustrating because it could be paranormal. Likewise, it could easily be faked, and of course it could just be something else entirely that we aren't aware of. I don't even know if there is a solution to this problem other than we just have to be really skeptical of paranormal videos. And as usual, by skeptical, what I mean is that at best all we can say is, that was weird, I don't know what caused it. That isn't necessarily a bad thing if all you want to do is entertain, but we're not going to be changing hearts and minds with grainy security camera video.
The trouble is, we kind of can't get rid of this problem now because there's always going to be just as many people willing to fake stuff as there are people actually showing real stuff.
Yeah.
And for me, I always try and err on the side of, if I don't have any reason to not believe it, to not take the person at their word, then I will take the person at the word. Because I know from my experiences, if I describe some of the stuff that I've seen that I know wasn't fake or pretend or made up, nobody would believe me because it sounds so outrageous.
Well, what else are you going to do? You're going to go, well, there's no point filming it because no one will believe it anyway. It's the only thing you can do. But, I don't know. Maybe someone else has a solution to this problem. I suppose the only thing you can do is try and replicate, see if it happens again, see if you can find out what's happening. But that doesn't make a news story.
No. I don't really get the headline of snooty ghost, though. Where did the snooty ghost come from?
Oh, it's because it flicks the cushion off the sofa.
As if it's dismissing, as if it's dissing, their idea of interior design. I think that is a bit of a leap for me. That's a bit of a leap. And in all fairness to the couple, if that was me, if I'd heard things rustling around in the night downstairs, and then I woke up the next morning and looked at the security camera and a cushion flew off the sofa, of course I would think it was paranormal. I wouldn't don my skeptic hat for long enough to think, well, maybe it was the wind or something. Not, unless it was really, really obvious. Your mind would instantly go to, wow, that's weird. What on earth's going on?
Are we perhaps giving them the benefit of the doubt because we may have had a similar situation ourselves recently?
Oh, the maths. Yeah, we had a bit of a paranormal blooper that turned out to be a bit more rodenty than we originally thought. If you keep up with us on social media, or you're a patron, you get the newsletter that we send out, you'll know that we've been battling invasions of flora and fauna recently at KOFY HQ, one of them being some mice in our bedroom. Now, the thing is, there weren't any visible signs of these mice, which is why we missed them for a while. But we did hear things rustling in the night. Only once, to be fair, but it woke us up. And being us, we just immediately assumed it was the ghost.
Yeah,
we didn't look into it anymore.
It's not unusual to hear things walking around KOFY HQ at night. You kind of get used to it.
To be fair.
It does seem a bit weird to be sitting here and saying, well, we just assumed it was the ghost. It wasn't the ghost.
No.
It was mice.
It was mice. And that wasn't our first thought at all. We heard something in the middle of the night that woke us up and we were just like, well, it must be paranormal.
Yes.
This is the point we've reached.
Yes. So luckily, looking on the bright side, it has kind of prompted us to build a new studio, which is going to be awesome.
Yeah,
but
keep an eye out on social media. And as I say, if you're Patron on the newsletter and stuff like that, we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the future. But it was really funny that our minds went immediately to ghost and not, oh, that might be a mouse.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on.
Indeed. So, moving on, we actually have something else that pinged the paranormal radar this month, and it's not a news story as such. Regular listeners will know that we are fans of Greg and Dana Newkirk, and I'm sure most of you are already familiar with them. But if not, they are, a lot of things. They made a bit of a splash in paranormal circles over the last couple of years with their paranormal documentary series Hellier. You may also have seen them on your teleboxes in things like Kindred Spirits and Haunted Salem Live, or even in person at paranormal conventions and events. They also run the Travelling Museum of the Paranormal and the Occult, which features a collection of haunted or otherwise paranormal related items that they display at conventions across the US and sometimes further afield. Now, with that which shall not be named going on, in-person conventions and events have been cancelled left and right, and this can be a bit of a problem if your job is attending these events in person. Not ones to sit on their laurels, the Newkirks decided that if they couldn't go to conventions, they'd bring the conventions to us by hosting an online paranormal convention called Phenomenacon. This year will be the third such Phenomenacon, and it will be taking place from the 25th to the 27th of February. Featuring guests such as Adam Berry and Amy Bruni from Kindred Spirits, Mark Pilkington from Mirage Men, Cliff Barrackman from Finding Bigfoot, and many others from the world of the weird and spooky, it looks like it's going to be an awesome weekend. And best of all, you can attend from your sofa and your gym jams. Perfect. For those of us not in the US, each day's events will be available to view for 16 hours after the live show, so if you aren't going to stay up till dawn like us, you can watch at a time to suit you.
Yeah, I think this is the third Phenomenacon they've put on now. This is going to be our first time attending, so we're pretty excited. But the way they've set it up, you don't sort of purchase a ticket as such. What you do is you subscribe for 1 month to their Patreon, at the $15 level. And that gets you not only a ticket to the whole weekend, which, to be honest, in itself is amazing because $15 for a ticket to a whole weekend of content is like really good value. But it also means that you're a supporting member for a month. And that means you can access a month's worth of their online back catalogue of all their bonus content, which is really cool. And by the way, this isn't a hashtag ad. We're not involved. We're literally just supporters. But one of the really actually good things, the silver linings, if you will, to come out of that, which will not be named for us, has been stuff like this. Online events, online conventions, things that we never would have been able to attend before. Like we could never go to a US paranormal convention and see all these speakers speak in person. That just was something that was not accessible to us at all. And now we get to join in
Mhm.
from our living room at a price we can actually afford, which is just amazing. So, of course, the only drawback is if you're not on US time, as we are not, it might mean some late nights if you want to stay up and actually join in with all the chat and Q&As and stuff like that. That's not really a problem for me. I've booked a couple of days off of work so that I can stay up till silly o'clock in the morning. But if you can't, as Fitz said, they're going to be replayed for 16 hours after the event. So hopefully everybody should have time to catch up.
Yep, they'll be replayed up until the start of the next day's event, so you can catch up right until the next day begins. And as usual, I'll be putting links to this in the show notes on the website so you can check out the full list of people attending, and they should hopefully have some times up there to let you know when it's starting and how you can tune in.
If you do go and you're in the Not Once VS Facebook group, we could always have a little chat between ourselves as well.
Yeah, definitely.
That could be fun. Like we could get the whole KOFY community that are attending, having a little chat, maybe set up a post just for that. It would be fun.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
Like a spooky pajama party. Well, with all that said, I think it's time to grab a brew, grab a blankie, settle in. It's story time, listeners. And this first one is from Kevin.
Now, I will freely admit that many of the things in this story are rather hazy, as this occurred when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, and I personally do not believe in the supernatural, nor do I think there's anything that cannot be explained by the machinations of one's mind. This event, if you want to call it that, occurred at my grandparents' summer cottage late in July as a child. This cottage was located high up on a ridge of what you could call a small peninsula. They had always made sure that the forest and all that goes along with it was kept as natural as possible. That meant a lot of mosquitoes. Forest mice and larger animals roamed around freely, and I truly loved spending time at this cottage. However, there was one thing that always made me nervous. You see, this summer cottage lacked an indoor loo, and instead there was an outhouse quite far from the main building. Being young with a far too active imagination, I dreaded walking there in the middle of the night, and still to this day, I cannot fathom why the loo was that far away and deep into the woods. I mean, realistically, it probably wasn't that far away, but it sure felt like a trek as a child. Lying in my bed at night, I could hear my parents and grandparents talking in the other room. Muffled voices, but reassuring that they were out there until I fell asleep. That is when the urge to go to the loo reared its ugly head. I mustered my courage and informed my parents in a tired voice that I was going to the outhouse. A normal occurrence, and they simply acknowledged it with an okay. In this area, raccoon dogs and foxes are quite common, and the short walk to the outhouse was always nerve-wracking, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight as they shifted around and away from you. To me, it felt like they were watching me, following me, which in hindsight they probably were, but without any ill intent. It was after my visit, and on my way back in the darkness with these eyes following me, that things started getting just a bit odd. Walking on the small path while keeping my eyes on those peering back at me, I saw my granddad walking silently towards me, a relief if I ever felt it. He stopped by the track as I walked up to him. I think he knew that I was scared of the dark, as he told me that whatever is out there looking at us is just making sure that we weren't a danger. They just feel safer in the dark where we can't see them. He then walked me down the path towards the cottage for a bit, before turning back towards the outhouse. I watched him walk up the path as I walked towards the house myself, and to my astonishment, as I entered the cottage, there he was, sitting with my parents just chatting. I can still remember the confusion in my adolescent brain trying to process how he was here already. Walking up to my family, I asked how he'd made it back so quickly. visibly confused, they informed me that he'd been there chatting the whole time. This realization sent shivers down my spine as I tried to explain that Grandad was just on his way to the outhouse and that I talked to him. I have no idea what my parents were thinking, but they told me that it was just my wild imagination and there's nothing bad out there. I truly cannot remember, but I doubt I slept much that night. Thinking back on it, some questions arise. Why did I not hear him walking, legs brushing against the blueberry plants on that path? Why was he walking me towards the house and consoling me? And why did he seem so real if it was just my imagination? Whatever the answers are to these questions, one thing is for sure. It made the walk back from the outhouse a lot less scary on that night.
And thank you so much to Kevin for sharing your experience with us. This is a peculiar one. I mean, we've had a lot of examples of things like doppelgangers, Vardogers, seeing people arrive home before they arrive home, that kind of thing. But this is a little bit different even from that.
It is, isn't it? I really love this story. One, because it does that traditional, I don't believe in ghosts, but that all awesome stories come from. But it also just goes to show that these sort of experiences don't have to be terrifying.
No.
Like, this was a really comforting thing. This was somebody saying, don't worry, it's fine. And walking them back to the house and then just disappearing. It's like that was its purpose, to reassure, to comfort. And in many cases, that's all these things are, or seem to be. Though I am glad that we've got an indoor loo.
I mean, always. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I love it for the fact that it's, whatever this thing was, it was just trying to help.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we love to label things, and you can't help asking the question, but what? What was it? We can't give it a convenient label. It's not a Vardoger. It's not a doppelganger.
No.
It's very unlikely to be a ghost, because obviously this is essentially the apparition of a living person that is only in the next sort of room.
Makes me wonder if it's like a time slip or something, where he had an experience a different night when perhaps you stayed in bed and didn't get up and he saw you.
Or is it like a projection of the person's consciousness? I don't know. I mean, we could go down so many rabbit holes, but it's a really interesting one to discuss.
Indeed, but I really liked it. I loved that it was, it was a bit creepy, a little bit weird, but it was also very pleasant and comforting and heartwarming. I really enjoyed that one. Thank you. Slightly less heartwarming story this time, and this one is from Molly.
My husband and I, along with our 3-year-old son and 12-year-old daughter, bought a home said to be built in 1860. Our son came downstairs one day not long after we'd moved in and told me Ebersol was in his room. Not knowing what he was trying to say, I settled him down to play. But another time he came downstairs at dark and told me that Ebersol came in the window and that he has no feet. Thinking it was a dream, I settled him again back in his bed and off to sleep he went. But this Ebersol would appear every now and then. Our son once told us that Ebersol said his father had hurt him. My husband and I didn't know what to think, but it didn't appear that our son was frightened. I'd gone upstairs to his room many times and nothing seemed to be out of place, so we didn't know what we should do. The next time Ebersol appeared, I told our son to go upstairs and tell Ebersol to go away. It's your room. And he did. And he never saw Ebersol again. We now use his bedroom as a guest room, and there are people who say there's just something about the room they don't like. No Ebersol, just a feeling, although sometimes they do have strange dreams.
And thank you to Molly for sharing that story. That there's nothing more creepy than a kid saying weird stuff.
No, it's fun enough.
Ebersol's in my room and he has no feet.
I know. Oh my goodness. What? Oh, why do children say the most creepy things? We've got another one of those coming up later, in fact. But I had a look for the name Ebersol because the thing that strikes me is that it's a really uncommon name. In fact, I couldn't find any use of it as a first name. However, there are plenty of examples of Ebersol as a surname. And apparently it is a name that originated in medieval Switzerland. So it's got a long lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And back in sort of the 1800s, it wouldn't actually be unusual to refer to yourself by your surname. Well, I suppose it's still not today in some circles, rather than your first name, especially if your first name is the same as another member of your family.
Mm-hmm.
That happened quite a lot. But that aside, it's such an unusual name. I can't see where a child of that age would have heard it to be able to repeat it.
Yeah, it's not one you sort of come across often in fiction or that sort of thing either.
No, if they had an imaginary friend or were just sort of, making things up, where on earth would they have got that name from to pluck that name out of the ether to use? I can't see that happening.
Especially with the mother saying, we didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah.
So it's not like, they were talking about it or they knew somebody that had that name or that sort of thing.
No. So that, for me, that just adds another sort of level to that. Funnily enough, I didn't do anything quite as creepy as that, but when I was a kid, I apparently just turned around to my parents and said, I need a boy doll for my birthday and he's going to be called Philip. And they were a bit weirded out because we didn't know anybody called Philip. I was really, really young, like too young that I don't remember this at all. I must have been about 4. We didn't know anybody that was named Philip. They hadn't been talking about anybody that was named Philip. It was just, they couldn't understand where I'd plucked this name from. And I was so certain about it as well.
This didn't happen around the same time as the Philip experiment, did it?
I don't know what year the Philip experiment was.
We're going to have to look that up.
We're going to have to look. This would have been about...
would be amazing.
85 or something, I guess.
Okay, we're going to have to look this up after the episode. If the Philip experiment happened around 85...
We'll find out.
Yeah.
We'll get back to you. But yeah, that was just a little nugget from my childhood of freaking my parents out somewhat. Well, moving on. We've got another listener story for you now, and this one is from Robert.
My first experience occurred in my childhood home in Briar Hill, Northampton. I suffered with night terrors as a child and would often extricate myself from bed to sleep in my sister's room or on the landing outside Mum and Dad's room. One time I woke up on the floor in my sister's room in the early morning and there was a boy sat on the end of my sister's bed, staring into the open wardrobe. He was dressed in a sort of old-fashioned country style, woolen trousers, linen shirt and a flat cap. He didn't move or really do anything and completely disappeared shortly after I woke up. It was the only paranormal experience I had in that house, and at the time I wasn't at all frightened, just confused. The second experience I recall was at a sunrise on the Towers at Gwithian in Cornwall. A group of friends and I had camped there, and I'd had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing the voices of the friends I was with, but they were all asleep. When it started getting light, I decided to get out of the tent and watch the sunrise, which was absolutely beautiful. It was midsummer, so it must have been just before 5, and I turned to the direction of the ocean. Floating above the footpath on the edge of the Towers was a bright white light, like a star or an orb. It floated along for a minute before going behind one of the dunes. I ran to the path to see if I could catch another glimpse, but it had gone. Since then, I've tried to rationalise the sighting as someone walking with a torch. But who needs a torch when it's light outside? And if it was a person, how would they have disappeared? I lived in a big old derelict house in Cornwall with 6 friends, and I know what you must be thinking, who would live in a derelict house? But the house had some sentimental qualities as it was owned by a good friend and her late husband, who'd been a mentor to myself and another friend who lived there with me, and who had passed away in the house. There weren't any scary things that happened, just movements in our peripheral vision and a sense of a presence. We all knew there was something going on unseen, as we'd all experienced the phenomenon. But we knew that if there was a ghost, it was our friend, and we took comfort in that. The last story is more malevolent. I lived in Northampton town centre for 6 months a few years ago with some friends. The house was a 3-bed terrace with a spooky cellar. One friend was a student, and he was probably at the house the most, and he'd always say there was something in the cellar. He'd have dreams of dark entities emanating from there, and he'd often pray against whatever forces were present. There were many noises that came from the cellar in the middle of the night, thuds and scrapes and such, and there'd always be a feeling of cold fear as you walked past in the dark to get to the only toilet in the house. I had a dream one night that I'd woken up and couldn't turn on my bedroom light. I called my housemate in to try it, and it flicked on first time, but as soon as they left the room, the light went off again. I tried calling them back, but they wouldn't come, so I left the room and was suddenly in the kitchen facing the cellar door. I knew that my friend was beyond the door, so I opened it and was swamped in a dark sentience, a malevolence that swept through my form and paralysed me. I tried to scream, but my lungs were empty and I couldn't draw breath. It took all of my will to pull myself awake again. I got out of bed and flicked the light switch, but it didn't turn on. I was still dreaming. The dream replayed. I was again filled with the darkness. I pulled myself awake. Again, the light didn't work, and the dream replayed. I don't know how many times I went through the trauma over and over again, but when I actually woke up, I couldn't trust my reality. I couldn't bring myself to even try the light switch. After a while, I knew it was over. Pulled my knees to my chest, declared the blood of Jesus over myself, and prayed that I'd be able to sleep again. I checked my phone and it had only been about half an hour since I'd gone to bed, but I'd just lived an eternity of looping dreams. I've never experienced anything like that before, and never since, but I'll never forget the dread of it.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing that experience with us. I think they're called Jacob's Ladder dreams. I've had one like this in the past, admittedly not anywhere near as terrifying as that. I can't actually remember what happened in the dream, but just the process of going back into the same dream and replaying
sort of looping
it
through
over and over and over. It is traumatic. It's really, truly awful. I've only experienced it once, and that was enough. I did not want to experience it ever again. But the other thing about this story is that, to begin with, as you were reading the first part of it about his house in Northampton, with the spooky basement and going to the loo in the middle of the night, I honestly thought you were talking about our old house in Northampton.
I did check that it wasn't that one, and he does say that the student that he mentions in the story did live on the same street that we used to live on before then.
No, you're joking. Oh
no,
my goodness.
It was a different road. It's close by. It's very close by. And he said that the person moved from that road to this house.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, when you were reading it, I was just like, is this the same house?
Yeah, I had to ask. I literally said, it wasn't so-and-so road, was it?
Yeah.
And he was like, no, but that person did come from there before.
Oh,
yeah.
My goodness. There is obviously something going on.
Something in the water up there.
There's something in the water.
So thank you again to Robert for that story. And now it's time for our last listener story of the episode. This one takes us a little bit up north to Liverpool, and it's from Pat.
When I was 17, I worked in a pottery studio. We were all invited to a pottery exhibition opening at the Blue Coat Arts venue, a historic building in Liverpool city centre. The exhibition was in the back area of the gallery shop, and it was a cheese and wine party. Well, it was 1980. To reach the shop, we had to cross the courtyard garden. This area has been revamped now, but at the time you entered by a door in the corner of the garden. Being mostly late teens, we were chatting excitedly. It was dusk in springtime and we'd gone straight from work. As I walked into the garden, something caught my eye. I turned my head to the left and I saw a young girl arm in arm with a smaller boy. The girl had long blonde hair, a calf-length dress with an apron over it, and boots rather than shoes. The little boy had brown curls and was dressed in an old-fashioned manner. I thought first of fancy dress. Then I realised, to my embarrassment, that the girl was blind and I was staring at her. I quickly turned my head away, but when I looked again, there was no one there. There was no door close to where they were walking that I could see, and I heard nothing opening or any sound produced by the children at all. She was quite far from the door that we'd used and would have passed us even if she'd had time to access it. Nowadays, there is a door directly next to where she was seen, but that didn't exist for another 25 years. I was confused. I believed that the Blue Coat had been part of a boys' school of that name, which still exists in South Liverpool. So why would a girl be there? I dismissed the experience, but never forgot it. I found later, when the internet was available, that it was an orphanage. Fairly recently, there was an exhibition of old sepia photos of the Victorian era. One was of orphan girls in their long dresses and white aprons working in the laundry. I felt a little thrill as I saw it. I wonder if she's ever seen now. The new door to the garden comes out exactly where I saw her all those years ago. I was already very familiar with the garden before my sighting, but now think of it whenever I am there. I have a number of other stories, but I'll never forget the little blind girl and her companion enjoying the garden on a lovely spring evening.
And thank you to Pat for sharing that story. I can't imagine the excitement that must have happened when you saw that photograph.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, that's the kind of the pinnacle. That's the thing you dream of happening, isn't it? For you to have seen something and then be able to corroborate the clothes that you saw and that kind of image, and know that it wasn't your mind randomly spewing something out.
You see, I've got this image in my head, like I want that to happen to me one day, and I'm imagining, for some reason, I'm imagining myself as a Victorian gentleman with a pipe,
a pipe,
with a pipe, going, "By Jove, have you seen this?"
That's what you aspire to.
Yeah, I think that
Victoria chat.
I
with
do
a pipe.
have a pipe. I don't smoke anymore, but I'll have to keep it on me just in case it ever occurs. So
and then you can whip it out specifically for that moment.
Point at the photograph with it.
With your pipe.
Yes. By Jove, have you seen this? Yeah, I shall practice to make it more authentic.
I look forward to the day that happens.
And that is all the listener stories for this episode. Thank you so much to all of you that shared your experiences. And we're always looking for more paranormal encounters. So if you've had an experience of something spooky, then please do get in touch to share your story through our website at knockonceforyes.com. But fear not, for it is not the end of the episode. We are off to Hertfordshire and the haunted town of Hitchin.
It's proving to be a bit of a long, cold and gloomy winter, and we haven't yet managed to get out and about very much. For this episode, we're rewinding a little bit to a visit we've been meaning to share with you for a long time now. So, we are excited to finally bring you our paranormal postcard from haunted Hitchin. We didn't travel too far from home for this one, Hitchin being only about an hour away at the top end of Hertfordshire. The peculiar story that drew us down to Hertfordshire in the first place actually lay a few miles south of Hitchin, but as we'd be passing through, we couldn't resist planning a stop-off in the ancient market town, and soon discovered that it had an ample helping of ghost stories of its own. So, on a blisteringly hot summer's day, we clambered stickily out of the coffee-mobile into a worryingly generic-looking town car park. And, not yet having our bearings, or indeed a map, we veered off instinctively for the cool and leafy-looking churchyard we could just spy ahead. But we needn't have worried. Generic-looking the car park may have been, but that was where the identikit modernised market town trope ended. So many of England's historic market towns have inescapably been chipped away at over the years, suffering cannon fire and deliberate demolition in the Civil War, taking bomb damage in World War II, not to mention natural disasters, town fires, and the all too often destructive stomp of modernisation. All of this unfortunately resulting in these towns, once a glorious mishmash of architecture, being reduced to a wizened high street of 70s concrete shop fronts, with the same rota of chain stores repeating itself endlessly across county after county after county. But we were pleasantly surprised to find that Hitchin seemed to have escaped the worst of this. Stumbling out of the car park, squinting into the blazing sunshine, we almost immediately found ourselves faced with what must be one of the most picturesque and probably most photographed spots in Hitchin. Standing at a columned stone balustrade over the calmly rippling River Hiss, we looked across at a scene that could have graced the box of a jigsaw puzzle simply titled British Summertime. Families picnicked on the vibrantly green and neatly mown banks of the river, seeking shade from ancient willow trees that bowed their supple branches down to kiss the water, and behind it all rose the warm yellow sandstone edifice of St Mary's Church. Now, you may have noticed, dear listener, that we often begin our exploration of a new place at a church, and there's a good reason for this. It's usually the most visible and easily identifiable building in an unfamiliar location. It's well marked on almost every type of map and therefore a fantastic place to get one's bearings or to regroup at later. But very often, the church will also mark the centre of the town's beginnings. So it's not only a great place to start an exploration on foot, but also a great place to start an exploration through history. The name Hitchin and that of the River Hiss, which runs through the town, seems to have evolved from a tribal name mentioned in a 7th century document called the Tribal Hidage, which was a list of English kingdoms. The tribal name is spelled Hicce, and I've heard it pronounced variously as Hicka, Hitchy, or simply Hitch. The written records of the town really start to appear when Offa, king of the Mercians, established a monastery at Hitchin in the year 792. Sadly, this first incarnation of the building only lasted just over 100 years before it burned down, and at this point the resident monks decided to move on to nearby St Albans. But this was only the first of the religious structures that were to grace these grounds, and by the time we reached the Domesday Book in 1086, records show that the site had been rebuilt as a church. For the next 200 or so years, this church suffered a volley of calamitous events that all resulted in sufficient destruction as to require partial or complete rebuilding. In 1115, it took damage from a great windstorm. In 1292, it was struck by lightning. An earthquake hit the church in 1298, and in 1304, the roof collapsed. As a result, most of what we can see today dates from the 14th and 15th centuries, although keen eyes will spot some Roman brick worked into the structure from one of the rebuilding efforts that repurposed building materials from the nearby abandoned Roman town of Verulamium. Rather excitingly, back in 1911, work on a new floor of the church uncovered evidence of an earlier Saxon building underneath the present structure, providing tantalising evidence of what might well be the remains of King Offa's monastery, foundations from a structure over 1,200 years old, still lurking right underneath the feet of St Mary's 21st century parishioners. So it seems that however many transformations the church has seen, The very roots of Hitchin are inextricably entwined within the bones of St Mary's Church. Despite the background hubbub of picnicking families and the bustle of the town beyond the churchyard, the atmosphere in the shadow of the church was tranquil. Snatches of music from a service happening inside escaped into the muggy summer air, and we spent a few carefree moments exploring, remarking over gargoyles and grotesques grimacing from the church walls, and carvings of winged and crossboned skulls adorning weathered and pitted gravestones. As we emerged from the peace and timelessness of the churchyard, we stepped into a bustling town centre that was positively humming with activity. Fortunately, our hapless and rather directionless amble spat us out directly in front of a tourist information centre, where, with the utmost glee, I was able to purchase a street map featuring the town's historic highlights for just a few pence. Now, you all know how much I love my maps, and even more handily, all of the paranormal hotspots we'd intended to visit were included. No longer directionless and clutching our new map and a copy of Haunted Hertfordshire, a ghostly Gazetteer bought especially for the trip, we began to hone in on our first haunted stop of the day. Our route took us straight into the market square, the hub around which the ancient market town of Hitchin has grown. As with any town that means to survive in our modern age, we were, of course, faced with shop fronts, cafes, and the brightly coloured canopies of market stalls. But my advice to anyone visiting a historic market town is to remember to look down at the ground and up above shop level. You'll be amazed at what you might have missed otherwise. In this case, rounded cobblestones, polished by years and the passage of thousands of footsteps, hint at the market's ancient origins, which date back to at least the 12th century. Whilst looking up above the level of the shop fronts soon dissolves the illusion of a modern town, but up here a kaleidoscope of architectural styles provide a feast for the eyes of anyone weary of the usual drab high street fare. It seems that somehow here in Hitchin, not only have a lot of the historic buildings survived, but most newer interlopers have at least tried their best to blend in, rather than succumb to grey, concrete utilitarianism. Even a certain insidious coffee chain sits under an elaborately decorative mock Tudor frontage dating from the 1920s. I know some feel it's sacrilege to copy historical styles so unashamedly, but personally I love it. I enjoy the higgledy-piggledy smush of different styles coming together to make a slightly out of time and place experience, because who wants boring old consistency anyway? And there are definitely a good smattering of Tudor-style split timber buildings that don't look at all mock to me. The exposed oak beams seem to be blackened with age rather than paint. The upper floors project out into the street with tilts and angles that look as though the contents of the room above may be in danger of sliding out into the street were one to open a window. The gravity of walls bowing and sagging with the weight of years, pulling the tiled roofs into haphazard undulations. If it's mock, it's certainly got me fooled. And either way, I think it's glorious. And it was not far from one of these gloriously wonky split timber buildings that we found our first paranormal stop of the day, the Sun Inn on Sun Street.
The Sun is itself a glorious mishmash of history. The red and blue brick frontage with its tall sash windows hails from the 18th century, but a prominent sign on the entrance of the hotel declaring the name of the bar within as the Cromwell gives us a hint of the inn's more distant past. In fact, the original building dates from around 1575, and back in those days, the street upon which it stood was known as Angel Street, not Sun Street, because at that time, the most popular hostelry in town was the Angel Vaults Inn, whose premises had entertained King Henry VIII, no less. The Sun Hotel was just an opportunistic upstart, built after the Angel Inn suffered fire damage in the early 1500s, and its regular customers were ripe for the purloining. The Sun was to gain its own notoriety, however, at the dawn of the English Civil War, when the hotel became the headquarters for more than 3,000 parliamentarian troops, an infamy which didn't make for good business in later years after the monarchy was restored to power. Local royalist sympathisers were not quick to forget the role the inn had played in accommodating the enemy. Some refused to give the inn their business. Others, fueled by long-held bitter resentments, even tried to boycott the place. Aside for the bar's name, however, there's little sign today of the hotel's place in this page of history. To our eyes, the wide central archway into an enclosed cobbled courtyard speaks of the 18th century coaching inn that it became in its heyday, when increasing coach traffic breathed new life and new business into the hostelry. If this conjures up images of musket-wielding highwaymen tearing into the cobbled yard to leap off their steaming horses, pistols in hand, well, you actually wouldn't be far wrong, and in 1772, the landlord and customers of the Sun really were held at gunpoint by highwaymen, who tied up staff and customers alike before looting the place. So far, so much standard pistol-point robbery, but in a peculiar detail, they didn't rush straight back out to leap upon the backs of their spooked prancing horses, making a hasty getaway in a clatter of hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Nope. They hung around for a bit to carve their initials into the hotel's brickwork, a feature which apparently still remains at the Sun's entrance to this day. I found this quite extraordinary. I mean, it's one thing leaving a hasty Sharpie tag on your way out, but it's quite another to stall your getaway long enough to carve your name into the wall of a brick building. You could be mistaken for thinking that events like highwayman holdups might seem to be the perfect opportunity for the makings of a ghost story, but, in fact, it's a much more genteel haunting that the 18th century left behind at the Sun Inn. Or at least one of them is. During the inn's coaching days, locals could enjoy a leisurely game of bowls on a specially laid green behind the hotel, and two of the most frequent patrons of this green were a couple of local vicars who regularly enjoyed a game of bowls and hearty conversation together at the Sun Inn. They enjoyed it so much, in fact, that it seems they never really left, and from the twilight shadows of the inn's garden on quiet summer nights, guests can sometimes still hear the low murmur of voices and the unmistakable clink of bowling balls. It isn't only phantom sounds that haunt the Sun Inn, though. In the Cromwell Bar, staff have witnessed the apparition of a tall, grey, cloaked figure they've described as looking like a monk. In one such experience, the witness was left in no doubt as to whether or not they were experiencing something supernatural in nature after the figure disappeared through a wall. I wasn't able to find anything to suggest the site of the pub had any historical connections to monks specifically, but with a history dating back to the 16th century, many different people could have been wearing the type of cloaks that look similar to how we might envision monks' robes. The other resident spirit of the Sun, though, is not such a gentle one, as guests staying in room 10 of the hotel have found out the hard way. Some visitors have actually declined to stay in the room mere moments after setting foot over the threshold, as confirmed by the hotel manager to authors Ruth Stratton and Nicholas Connell for their book Haunted Hertfordshire, a Ghostly Gazetteer. The manager does not go into detail as to what kind of discomfort or dread overcomes the visitors upon entering the room, but evidently it's left a number of guests so ill at ease that they've refused to sleep there. One guest, however, either didn't notice or didn't heed the unsettling atmosphere of the room, and sleep there he did. That is, until the early hours of the morning, when he jolted awake in a surge of adrenaline, choking and gasping for air. He described how he'd felt someone smothering him with their whole body weight, convinced, for some reason that isn't explained, that his assailant was a woman. Far too terrified to try and find any more sleep that night, the shaken man walked right out of the hotel and paced the streets of Hitchin until the safe light of morning came. Now, some of you may be thinking, maybe even remembering from your own experiences, that the horrendous condition of sleep paralysis, a fairly common sleep disorder often brought on by stress, can feel an awful lot like a weight bearing down on you, and even sensations of choking or not being able to breathe. However, don't be too quick to jump to any conclusions just yet, because that wouldn't explain the fact that another unfortunate guest of room 10, this time a man visiting the hotel in the 1980s, had a terrifyingly similar experience. He too was awoken in the early hours of the morning, but this time the alarm was caused by his bed being violently shaken. Startled, he opened his eyes and was horrified to see a dark figure with claw-like hands looming over him. The account records his unnerving recollection that the apparition seemed to have no face. This would be enough to send most guests running from the room, but it wasn't to end there, not yet. The ghastly figure then launched itself at the prone man. He described feeling the weight of the thing on top of him, pressing down on him, of being stunned into mute shock, unable to cry out for help. He recalls an image of the claw-like hand hanging over his face, and then the figure vanished. Unsurprisingly, this guest also felt the need to urgently vacate the premises, and found themselves wandering the dark streets of Hitchin until rescued by daybreak. Standing in the street, staring up at the rows of tall sash windows, I wonder which belongs to the notorious Room 10, and whether I'd be brave enough, or foolhardy enough, to try to sleep there given the chance. I have to say, I think I'd rather run into a ghostly game of bowls, or even a disappearing phantom monk in the bar.
But we have plenty more haunted locations to get to yet, and so we move on, heading down Sun Street, passing by the new incarnation of the Angel Vaults Inn, a homage to the original inn which had once given the name of Angel Street to this very road. There was a festive atmosphere, bunting hung across the street, people spilling out of cafes into makeshift street seating, the headiness of summer heat getting under everybody's skin. At the end of the street, we welcomed the sight of a couple of old, well-established trees offering a cool canopy of shade under which to retreat from the afternoon sun for a moment. I'm not sure how long those trees had stood there, but from the thickness of their trunks and the breadth of their canopies, I think it would be safe to say that they'd seen a few generations come and go in their lifetime. I wondered what dramas they'd witnessed over the years, for these trees stood at the end of the formal-looking drive to Hitchin Priory. Now there's a reason it looks formal, because these days the Priory functions as a hotel, conference centre and wedding venue. There's a definite air about the place that it's not a building that just anyone can rock up to and start wandering around. Certainly not a couple of slightly dishevelled paranormal nerds like ourselves. And the signs and notice boards outside back up our suspicion that we're not going to get much of a peek at the Priory today. We make a gallant effort to see if there's any way we can ferret out a viewpoint that will give us a glimpse. But after exploring every potential nearby public footpath, accidentally walking right out of Hitchin and generally getting hot, bothered and even more dishevelled, we had to concede defeat, winding up right back where we started under the shade of the trees on the Priory's drive, where we mollified ourselves by sharing some of the ghost stories that sprung from the walls of this old place. The origins of Hitchin Priory date back to 1317, when it was founded as a Carmelite friary of St Mary, and the building continued to serve as a priory all the way up to 1538, when the dissolution of the monasteries resulted in it being sold into private ownership. And so it remained for around 400 years, until it passed into the hands of Hitchin County Council. With the first 200 years of its life spent as a friary, and the potential for discontented souls of friars thrown out on their ears by Henry VIII hanging around, one might quite rightly expect some phantom monks to be roaming the grounds of the old priory, but it actually seems to be female apparitions that are sighted most often. Even during the long period that the priory was owned by the Radcliffe family, an ownership which lasted from 1553 to 1964, there were tales of a grey lady apparition haunting the property. And, according to the aforementioned ghostly Gazetteer, one curious soul even went to the local newspaper asking for anyone with knowledge or information regarding the spirit to come forward. But the first description of an encounter with one of the priory's resident spirits doesn't quite seem to fit the stereotypical grey lady bill. In fact, this encounter seems to have occurred in full technicolor glory to the confused witness, a local butcher, who was awaiting the arrival of an acquaintance in Priory Park, the extensive 19-acre grounds of the Priory, in 1816. As the man was standing, expectantly awaiting his companion, he realised that he was being approached by a woman in a red cloak and black hat. Not knowing who this could be or why she was coming towards him, he glanced away, maybe to see if she was heading towards an unnoticed person behind him. But by the time he looked back, she had vanished. Somehow, there was suddenly just no sign of her, and yet there was nowhere she could have gone to vanish from sight so quickly, no cover that she could have ducked behind in the brief moment he had looked away. Our next sighting at the Priory takes us all the way forwards in time to the 1980s, during the period that Hertfordshire County Council was using the building as an education centre, and involves another female apparition. However, the description of this phantom figure is quite different to the mysterious lady our 19th century witness encountered. This time, the witness was a member of staff, the assistant caretaker, who was going about his usual duties on the top floor of the boys' wing one afternoon, when he was perplexed to experience a sudden icy chill creep through the room, along with the inexplicable feeling that someone was watching him. He could feel the presence of another person and looked about him in confusion, knowing full well that he should have been alone. But as he turned, his eyes met those of a woman, dressed in a short-sleeved blouse and a necklace made from a single pearl. Not such an unusual description, you might think, were it not for the fact that only the top half of the woman was visible, and she appeared to be floating above the stairs at the end of the corridor. But the most famous ghost story associated with Hitchin Priory is one of lost love, the grief of a couple whose future together was cruelly snatched away from them, still resounding through the quiet, still streets of Hitchin after dark. The tale takes us back to the English Civil War and the role Hitchin played as a parliamentarian stronghold, meaning that a certain royalist cavalryman who was very much in love with a maid working at Hitchin Priory would quite literally be risking life and limb were he to make a clandestine visit through enemy territory in order to meet with his love. But love makes us reckless, and the pair longed to be together, so the cavalryman risked it all and went under cover of night to Hitchin Priory. Unfortunately for our star-crossed couple, his movements were not stealthy enough, and he was discovered by parliamentarian troops who mercilessly chased him down and slayed him. Some say that on certain summer nights, you can still hear the clatter of his horse's hooves through the streets, the echo of his desperate attempts to flee resounding through the ages. We see a slightly different version of this tale in Peter Underwood's famous work, The Gazetteer of British Ghosts. although it does still involve our ill-fated couple. In this recounting, our royalist soldier, whom we learn is named Goring, is injured in a Civil War skirmish and retreats to a hidden chamber above the roof of a house in the nearby village of Purton. But he does not find safety there for long, because soon the parliamentarians arrive and begin searching the property. Goring briefly manages to escape, heading towards Hitchin Priory and his betrothed, taking refuge in a hollow elm tree on the grounds. But alas, he doesn't make it out of this tale alive either. His hiding place is discovered by parliamentarians and he's slaughtered. This version also features a macabre twist to the story, stating that as he is killed, his betrothed watched helplessly from an upstairs window of the Priory as her fiancé was brutally murdered, which has led many to wonder if the mysterious Grey Lady of Hitchin Priory is none other than the tortured shade of the soldier's betrothed. This rendition gives us not only a name and a slightly more grisly ending, but also a date, as the entry states that the doomed royalist soldier can be seen to repeat his desperate attempt at escape every year on the 15th of June, when he rides headless to the Priory, although the reasons for his apparition appearing headless are not discussed any further in Peter Underwood's book.
After our rest under the cool shade on the Priory's lawn, we have just one more place to visit on our walking tour of Hitchin town, and it takes us up the road to a building that once played a pivotal role in the history of education. But to paranormal investigators, it's probably better known as the Dead Street School. A very dramatic sounding name, I'm sure you'll agree, but it hasn't been fabricated just for spooky effect. The road we're walking along is now named Queen Street, but until the 19th century, it really was called Dead Street, and it was not a nice place to live. The street was at the centre of Hitchin's poor district, consisting of a warren of narrow streets and overcrowded slums with no sanitation. So it's little wonder that when the Black Death cast its terrible shadow over Hertfordshire in 1349, the disease spread like wildfire through the dingy, cramped and dirty slums. And in fact, it's said to have wiped out the whole community, earning the road the name of Dead Street, and leaving behind rumours about plague pit burials in the area that would persist for years to come. Dead Street kept not only the name, but also the slums right up until 1849, when a public health report found the area to still be overcrowded and dangerously unsanitary, sparking calls for improvements and rebuilding. It didn't happen overnight, but by the 1920s the slums had been cleared, the residents rehomed, and the town sought to put the grisly past of Dead Street behind them, renaming the road Queen Street in honour of Queen Victoria. This might seem like enough notoriety for one street all on its own, but the trail of ghost stories we're following takes us along this street to an unassuming Victorian brick building housing a museum. The British Schools Museum, in fact. Now, as much as I love history, I can't say that a museum showcasing and recreating the environment of a Victorian school would be my first choice to visit. Maybe the memories of the schools I attended in my formative years were just too traumatizingly fresh, all of them being themselves housed in Victorian-built schoolhouses. We may have had a more progressive curriculum. After all, I'm not quite that old. But I certainly experienced the Victorian lack of central heating, the dark, imposing classrooms, the drafty windows and cold, empty fireplaces, wooden desks with their stained inkwells, now unused and collecting pencil shavings, the outhouse toilet blocks with their strangely water-repelling tissue paper, and the clinical smell of carbolic soap. But unhappy school memories aside, Even I can't resist the slew of ghost stories knocking around the walls of this unique building. And it really is unique. Many of the rooms of this schoolhouse have been faithfully restored to show the real schoolrooms that existed within the building throughout the centuries. One of these is a Lancasterian schoolroom, and it's the only surviving example in the world. I will hold my hands up and say that before our visit to Hitchin, I'd never heard of Joseph Lancaster. But it turns out that his life's work may well have affected my childhood education, and likely many of yours as well, despite being a name conspicuously absent from the history books. Joseph Lancaster came from an 18th century working class background with a patchy education, and back then, those two things constituted some serious obstacles to inciting any meaningful change in the world. But Lancaster had a vision of a brighter future for children of all backgrounds, achieved through better and more accessible education. The museum displays a list of Lancaster's beliefs that were the driving force behind his mission to improve education. He believed that all children had potential that could be released through education, that children should be rewarded and motivated instead of beaten, that school should be free and children should be provided with food while attending, and that teachers should be properly trained, paid, and respected. In short, he was way ahead of his time, and those would have been some pretty controversial beliefs amongst many of his contemporaries. But these are the values that he brought to Hitchin when he and local philanthropist William Wilshire set up the first Lancasterian School in Hertfordshire in 1810. Lancaster developed his own way of teaching that allowed one teacher to educate up to 300 pupils at a time using only one book. It was called a monitorial system and involved the teacher delivering the lesson to one suitably capable student from each age group, known as a monitor, and the monitors then delivering the lesson to their peers. Lancaster even designed a purpose-built schoolroom to achieve the most effective use of this method, a method which eventually spread up and down the country and across the world, a revolutionary education movement. Many Lancasterian schoolrooms were built, but only this one, in this unassuming Victorian brick building in Hertfordshire, still survives. We often think of schools, especially 19th century schools, as unhappy places, but maybe with Lancaster's system of encouragement and reward, this school on Dead Street actually holds happy memories for many of its long-dead pupils. There are certainly plenty of unexplained sightings seeming to indicate that not all the pupils who pass through these halls have entirely left. The Lancasterian schoolroom isn't the only room recreated in the museum. The building was in use as a school right up until the 1960s, so some rooms are recreated with the desk and inkwell setup that many of us find more familiar. And from these areas, staff report hearing the noise of desk lids slamming, furniture being dragged, and the eerie sound of children laughing from empty and locked rooms. The unexplained sounds of walking from an upstairs corridor when the building is supposed to have been shut up for the night have warranted after-hours searches to ensure no visitors have been accidentally locked in, but the searches always turn out to be fruitless. Several staff members have admitted to feeling very uncomfortable when locking up alone at night, and some have even felt an unseen hand tapping them on the shoulder. In a documentary produced by Hitchin TV, a local television production company, a member of museum staff recalled being told by a colleague of their strange experience. Whilst eating lunch in the museum offices one day, he was startled to see a small group of 3 or 4 children wearing what appeared to be Victorian clothing, staring in the window at him, almost as though envious of his sandwiches. He was so surprised that he turned to remark to his colleague, But when he turned back only a second later, the children had vanished without a trace. A slightly more disturbing account came from a visitor to the museum, or rather her young daughter. The visitor sought out museum staff after the incident to ask if the building was haunted. When she was asked why, the mother responded that whilst taking her daughter to the bathroom, the young girl had stared and pointed at something in the room, unseen to the mother's eyes, and asked, "Mummy, what's that baby doing in the corner?" Of course, there was no baby in the corner, or anything else for that matter. Why is it that children always say the most terrifying things? Pupils at the school during the 1950s reported hearing distinctive limping footsteps along a corridor above the infant school, and these ghostly footsteps have for a long time been associated with a previous headmaster of the school, Mr. Fitch, on account of him having a club foot and one leg shorter than the other, which many think would account for the odd gait of the disembodied footsteps. Fitch was the longest-serving headmaster of the school and lived in the adjoining headmaster's house on site, which still stands to this day and has been restored to look just as it would have done during Fitch and his family's residency. Mr. Fitch was headmaster to 3,333 pupils during his time at the school from 1854 to 1899, and even after he retired, he continued to live out his remaining years in the headmaster's house next door, until he passed away in the parlour in 1902. With so much of his life invested in the school, and with the added catalyst of his former home now once more looking unchanged from his and his family's time there, it's hardly surprising that his spirit is seen and heard about the place on occasion, with unexplained footsteps heard from empty rooms and shadow figures seen walking around upstairs. Perhaps more surprisingly then, the most vividly experienced apparition seems to be that of Mr. Fitch's wife. During recent years, a staff member was called out to the headmaster's house by a visitor, who informed him in no uncertain terms that they had just witnessed the unmistakable shade of Mrs. Fitch walking right through the kitchen. But the best part for any avid paranormal investigators who might be marvelling at the reports of all this activity is that not only can you visit the British Schools Museum, but there have also been paranormal investigations held there. In fact, the production company we mentioned earlier, Hitchin TV, have put together their own team of ghost hunters and filmed their paranormal investigations in the museum. For us, though, we've reached the end of our exploration of Hitchin, for today at least. We wish we had more time, because we know we've barely scratched the surface of the history, legends and ghosts of the town. But it's getting late. We're hot, weary and hungry, and we've got one more visit to make yet, and that's going to require a bit more legwork. We head back to the KOFY to get refreshed as best we can before driving 4 miles south of Hitchin to find a dusty scrap of a car park on the edge of Hitch Wood, just outside the village of Preston. This is as far as the car will take us towards our last stop of the day, and we must complete the rest of the journey on foot. So we check our map and find the public footpath that will take us to a ruined chapel in the woods.
We could have opted to walk the first part of the route along a stretch of road, but it's a narrow road with few places to leap out of the way of oncoming traffic, and we do prefer a leisurely hike to playing traffic roulette. So we opt for picking up a section of the long-distance footpath the Hertfordshire way instead. What we didn't realise was that this section of the trail is actually bridleway rather than footpath, and is mostly traversed by horses, not people, and from what we found, not many horses at that. So the path we find is not at all well trodden. In fact, it's in full bloom, with shoulder-height nettles and brambles that grab and pluck at our clothes and skin like so many jealous hands. And we were quite grateful to tumble out, somewhat scratched and stung, into a much tamer field full of crops, from which we could see a mercifully clear and well-worn footpath, making a beeline for the edge of a small copse and our destination. Because this section of the Hertfordshire Way runs right alongside the ruined and haunted Minston Chapel. You could argue that it was paranormal investigator and author Peter Underwood who cemented Minston's place in the annals of paranormal history by including it in his widely referenced Gazetteer of British Ghosts and Ghost Hunters Handbook. In it, he references the local legend that anyone visiting the ruins at midnight on Halloween will hear the phantom sound of the long-lost church bells of the chapel ringing out into the empty night. And, just as the sound starts to die away, anyone brave enough to still be hanging around will witness the shadowy apparition of a monk, solemnly walking from the ivy-covered archway to mount a set of stairs that have long since disappeared. In fact, these days, even the iconic ivy-covered archway from this famous ghost story has crumbled and fallen to ruin. But that's hardly surprising given that the chapel has been in a ruinous state since the 1600s. Really, it's more surprising that there's anything left of it at all. It's thought that there's been a chapel at Minston since the 11th century, based on a 1086 Domesday Book entry which lists a resident priest in the Minston manorial record, along with 8 villains, 2 cottars, and 6 serfs. For many years, the chapel served the farming communities of Minston and the nearby villages of Preston and Langley, as well as being a place of respite for pilgrims along their route to visit St Albans Abbey. Discovering this led me to wonder if anybody still made that journey today, to the modern-day St Albans Cathedral, the oldest known place of Christian pilgrimage in the country, according to their website. And it turns out that the 192-mile long-distance trail that we'd very briefly picked up does indeed wend its way to the cathedral from here. I wondered to myself if the continuation of people passing by here en route to St Albans, pilgrims or not, could affect the energy of this mysterious place in any way. It's certainly been a long time since any pilgrims took their respite at the chapel, however, as by the end of the 16th century and the Reformation, attendance at the chapel had started to dwindle. The villagers couldn't afford to keep a minister in residence, so they occasionally borrowed one from the larger church of St Mary's in Hitchin, who would travel in to conduct weddings, baptisms and funerals. But without a full-time minister, or funds for upkeep, the chapel started to become neglected. The first record of it falling into ruin was as early as 1650. And although money was raised for repairs, the person holding the much-needed funds passed away and the money was lost, leaving Minston to further decay. The final blow came when villagers were ordered to pay taxes towards the upkeep of St Mary's Church in Hitchin instead, despite never having been responsible for these costs before. So with nothing left over to save their own chapel, Minston's fate was sealed. After that, the looting started. With no hope for restoration, locals began taking what they could from the place instead. Lead, stone, oak, even the church bells were taken. A villager from Langley was fined when the church font was discovered in his home being used as a sink. Some of the stained glass even found its way over to our old acquaintance, the Sun Inn at Hitchin. Oddly though, the locals were reluctant to give it up as a place of worship. Even reduced and stripped to an empty shell, with ivy creeping through holes in the roof and the stonework crumbling, weddings continued to be held here right up into the 1730s. The last wedding at Minston took a rather dramatic turn when a large chunk of masonry plummeted from the roof and nearly took out the curate delivering the ceremony. Fortunately, it narrowly missed his head and smashed the service book out of his hand instead. But from that moment forwards, it was deemed too dangerous to continue holding ceremonies there. I wonder what it was about the ruined chapel that kept the locals so enamoured of it, stripped and decaying as it was. By all accounts, they seemed to find a certain romance and mystery to the place, as discussed by local historian Reginald Hine in his book The History of Hitchin, written in 1929. In it, he states that he knows quite ordinary people who carry flints from Minston Chapel about with them wherever they go. One of them ascribed her recovery from a serious illness entirely to the healing power of the talisman beside her bed. Maybe Hine himself found some healing power within the ruins of the chapel. Certainly, he seemed to become enthralled with it, something which is very evident from his writings on the history of the building. Something about it fascinated him, to the point where he appeared to feel a kinship with and a responsibility for the place. Eventually, he managed to obtain a lifetime lease of Minston from the vicars of Hitchin, in the hopes of protecting and preserving it. Effectively, he made himself a guardian of the ruined chapel, a responsibility he took so seriously he was willing to commit to it not only in this life but also in the next. In The History of Hitchin, he threatens dire consequences for anyone intending to desecrate his beloved ruins, making clear his intent to continue protecting it even after his death, with the words, "Let trespassers and sacrilegious persons take warning, for I will proceed against them with the utmost rigour of the law. Furthermore, if, as is possible, I am buried there, I will endeavour in all ghostly ways to protect and haunt its hallowed walls." And that's not the only slightly spooky thing he included in his book. He also published a picture taken by a photographer friend of his, Thomas William Latchmore. The picture shows the overgrown ruins of the chapel, and within them, a translucent, cowled figure can be seen. Of course, many people dared to hope that this was finally evidence of the Phantom Monk, and inevitably piqued the interest of those working in the paranormal field. Enter Eliat O'Donnell, ghost hunter, paranormal author, and still a controversial figure to this day, with many questioning whether he blurred the lines between his fiction and his factual works. O'Donnell was shown the photograph of the ghostly apparition at Minston and convinced the photographer, Hitchin local William Latchmore, to take him into the woods to investigate the place for himself. O'Donnell gives his account of the investigation in his book Haunted Churches, but if he did use any creative license for this one, then he only spent it on calamitous humour, because the whole thing reads like one long paranormal blooper. O'Donnell enthusiastically embraced the spirit of the local legend for his visit to Minston, arranging for the investigation party he'd rustled up to trek out to the woods in time for midnight on Halloween, to take advantage of, as he puts it, one of the nights of the year where denizens of the spirit world are believed to be in closest touch with the material inhabitants of this plane. He evidently did not want to miss any opportunity to witness the ghostly action, so he employed the services of a psychic witch, who he hoped would be able to stir up the spirits should the activity turn out to be lacking. He did not, however, foresee that the good lady witch would embrace the spirit of the Halloween night just as much as he. Only for her, this meant arriving at the train station in full ceremonial garb, including high cap, cloak, and broomstick. These days, of course, no one would bat an eyelid at such an outfit at a train station on Halloween, or probably any day for that matter. But back in the 1920s, it caused quite a stir, with passengers and O'Donnell's friends alike making themselves suddenly and conspicuously scarce. The consternation continued at the residence of the photographer Latchmore, who lived with two very proper elderly relatives, both of whom took great offence at the sight of the scandalously odd-looking party, all but refusing entry to the photographer's studio. Eventually, though, the intrepid investigators made it to the woods and spent several long, cold, and damp hours trying every spell and incantation they knew to try and make the famous ghost appear out of the pitch darkness, but to no avail. In fact, the only thing that spooked them that night was a loud gunshot ringing out in the distance, an odd noise to hear in the early hours of the morning in the middle of the countryside. By 4 a.m, the party had given up hope of seeing any kind of apparitions that night and began the cold and muddy trudge out of the copse through mist-shrouded trees. When suddenly, through the veil of fog, dark shapes began to emerge. Figures leered out of the grey murk, forming into human shapes and heading straight towards them. "Halt!" shouted one of the apparitions. Stepping out of the mist, the figures were not apparitions after all, but the police, hunting down the culprits of a break-in at the railway booking office who had shot a firearm at an official before absconding into the night. Well, that explained the gunfire they had heard at any rate. But now it seemed that these policemen reckoned they'd found their offenders, because after all, for what other purpose might a band of men be creeping about the countryside in the early hours of a damp and misty October morning in the dark? "We were looking for ghosts," the aspiring investigators explained. "That's a good one." I can picture the tired, damp and irritated Bobby spluttering darkly through his mist-beaded moustache. "You don't expect us to swallow that?" Unluckily, some of the group had fallen behind the main party, and these stragglers included the photographer Latchmore, the only local amongst them and the only one who personally knew the policeman, and could, therefore, vouch for their innocence. So the men had to placate the constabulary long enough for him to catch up and confirm the real reason they were abroad at such an unearthly hour with a cloaked woman wielding a broomstick. You can imagine there must have been a few eyebrows raised that night, and plenty of gossip over brews down at the station later. Having narrowly escaped an erroneous arrest, the troupe then had to deal with smuggling the witch back into Latchmore's studio under the noses of his decidedly Victorian aunts, who were, quite probably, the most terrifying aspect of their Halloween adventure. Surprisingly, though, this didn't put O'Donnell off making a repeat visit, but the next excursion went just as badly. Evidently, his previous investigation had become well-worn local gossip, and the residents of Minston decided to prank the author, using a sheet draped to look like a hooded figure and setting off lights and explosions. So it seemed O'Donnell was doomed never to witness the ghost of Minston. But what of the ghostly photograph that prompted the investigation in the first place? Well, unfortunately, that too was a prank. Eventually, the photographer, Latchmore, confessed that he'd set up the shot using a double exposure, and a friend dressed in a sheet. And to bring us full circle in true Scooby-Doo fashion, many strongly suspect that the friend in the sheet was none other than the historian and author of the History of Hitchin, Reginald Hine himself. Maybe he was trying to scare trespassers away from the chapel, or maybe he just couldn't resist the idea of including a ghostly picture of the ruins for his book. Maybe it was just an experiment or a prank that got away from the two men, who then found themselves unwilling to dash the hopes of would-be believers. Sadly, we'll never know. But it seems unlikely that Hine was being disparaging to believers of the paranormal, given that he had experienced the supernatural firsthand himself, not at Minston, but at the Elizabethan manor home of a friend. Hine was disturbed in his sleep one August night at the manor by the unnerving feeling that there was someone else in the room. Gingerly sitting up in bed, he was shocked to see what he described as a tall, fragile woman of about 35 coming through the wall. And if this wasn't alarming enough, the apparition continued towards the author, passing clean through a chest of drawers and a chair as she did so. Hein managed to hold his nerve right up until the point where the figure stretched out her hand to touch his head, and then, quite understandably, he screamed in terror, and the figure abruptly vanished. From this, and from the way he waxes lyrical about the atmosphere of the ruins of Minston in his book, it certainly feels like Hein felt there was something more to the stories of the haunting of the chapel. But has anybody actually witnessed it? Well, as with all local ghost traditions, it had to start somewhere. At some point, now lost to the mists of time, someone saw something to spark the tale. But that doesn't mean it was ever recorded in print, and it does seem that may be the case here. One person who did have an experience at Minston, though, was Peter Underwood, which presumably served as the inspiration to include the chapel in 2 of his books. It was an encounter that will ring true to all paranormal investigators across the world, in that despite spending multiple nights at the location investigating and experiencing nothing, Underwood's experience happened during a quick daytime reconnaissance, so they were completely unprepared to record it in any fashion. He describes how himself, his brother, and a friend were exploring the ruins when they heard a snatch of music for which they could find no explanation. Having been to the place myself, I can confirm that it's very isolated, and the risk of sound contamination is really slim even today, let alone during Underwood's time, when the roads and surroundings would have been even quieter. Even more oddly, Underwood noted that both himself and his friend heard the music, even though the friend was 10 yards away. Strangely though, the author's brother was only 1 step behind him, and yet he didn't hear a thing. Only one question remains then. Did Reginald Hein get his wish to be buried on the site of the chapel to continue his guardianship of Minston in the next life? Well, sort of. He wasn't buried at the site, but his ashes were scattered there, and a memorial stone was erected for him within the chapel ruins. In fact, it's still there to this day. Mossy, worn, overgrown and lying flat, but there nonetheless, forever linking him to the place he loved so much in life. And as resting places go, you couldn't ask for much more. Atop a rise, the chapel grounds look out across a stunning view of the rolling Hertfordshire countryside. As we stand there breathing it all in, we see 2 roe deer grazing in the fields below us, an unusual, even magical sight these days in our increasingly busy and built-up country. The ragged bones of the ruined chapel rise out of the overgrown foliage like some great organic entity. The age-softened grey flint skeleton peeks in and out of view between the gently waving branches of elder and stands of nettles. Other than the occasional drift of butterflies exploding from the undergrowth as we brush past, the heavy summer air is still, with an almost sleepy tranquility. But there is something, an atmosphere of otherness, of mystery, something which I suspect the long-past residents of Minston picked up on just as our historian Reginald Hein did. It's difficult to put into words, and I don't think I can sum it up better than Hein himself did in the history of Hitchin. So today, I'll leave you with his words. Minston is for those rather whose minds are in ruins, for those sons of quietness who are distracted by the crimes and follies and misfortunes of mankind. In its deep shade, many have found healing and consolation and repose. They are one with twilight's dream. It's not only that the very air at Minston is tremulous with that faint susurrus. Call it the undersong of the earth, the music of the spheres, the sigh of departed time, or what you will, which only the more finely attuned spirits overhear.
And that somewhat florid expression of Hein's ardour for Minston brings us to the conclusion of this episode's Paranormal Postcard.
And you thought my writing was flowery. I love it though. And Hein really does seem to sort of sum up this odd feeling of otherness about the place. Minston Chapel isn't spooky, but it does have a mystery about it somehow.
I kind of found it soothing.
Well, and he references that in his book, the healing prop. A lot of the locals believed it to have healing properties and even took flints from the place as like healing talisman. Unfortunately, although it was accessible to the public for years, we found a very recent newspaper article that says that Minston has now been sold into private ownership, so you can't visit anymore, or at least you can't go into the chapel. But the Hertfordshire Way public footpath does run right alongside of the chapel, and you can see the ruins from the footpath. So if you want to go and visit, just use the public footpath. Don't take any flints, though, as healing talismans, please. We also want to say a huge thank you to Miss Scarlett on Twitter, who helped us with the research into Eliat O'Donnell's experiences at Minston. Thank you so much. Sometimes it's really difficult to corroborate these experiences because we just can't own every out-of-print book that we need to conduct our research. But fortunately, the Twitterverse and the Hive Mind and our wonderful supporters came to the rescue for us on this one. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
And that really is all we have time for this episode. Thank you to everyone that shared their stories with us. And don't forget that if you've got a story to share, you can get in touch through our website at knockOnceForYes.com. A huge thank you to our patrons and KOFY supporters. Your support is vital in helping us to continue producing the show. And if you're not currently a patron, Repod or KOFY supporter, then please do consider doing so from as little as $1 a month. Knock Once for Yes is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio, and if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Knock Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we'll see some of you in the chat at Phenomenacon. And we hope that you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Knock Once for Yes.
If I please listen, then